The crack of a gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Cody, Wyoming, freezing Felicity Collins mid-step as she hurried toward the general store. It was the spring of 1885, and the town was supposed to be civilized now, or so they claimed. The bullet splintered the wooden post just inches from her face, sending fragments flying across her cheek. She knew immediately who had fired it. Frank Donovan had found her again. Felicity ducked behind a water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed her back against the rough wood. The blue calico dress she'd saved 3 months to buy was now soaked with dirty water, but that was the least of her concerns. She'd been running from Frank for nearly 2 years now, ever since she'd refused his proposal and he'd shown her the true nature of his temper. "Felicity," his voice boomed down the street. "Come on out, darlin', you know I'll find you eventually." She peered around the edge of the trough. Frank stood in the middle of the street, his duster billowing in the spring breeze, revolver hanging casually in his hand. Several townsfolk had disappeared inside nearby buildings, doors slamming shut behind them. No one wanted to get involved. No one ever did. "I just want to talk," Frank called, his voice deceptively gentle now. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Felicity knew what his version of talking entailed. The last time it had left her with 3 broken ribs and a promise that if she ever ran again, he'd kill her. She had run anyway, working her way through half a dozen towns across 3 states, taking whatever honest work she could find. For 6 months, she'd thought she was free. But Frank Donovan never forgot and he never forgave. She was contemplating making a dash for the alleyway when she felt a presence behind her. Whirling around, she nearly collided with a broad chest clad in a faded blue shirt. Her eyes traveled upward to meet a pair of intense green ones beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson. "Stay down," the stranger murmured, his voice low and steady. "I'll handle this." "You don't understand," Felicity whispered frantically, clutching at his arm. "That's Frank Donovan. He's killed men for less than interfering with his business." The stranger's expression didn't change. He simply checked the revolver at his hip with practiced ease. "That's so. He'll kill us both," she said, her voice breaking. The cowboy's mouth curved into a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then let him try." Before she could stop him, he rose smoothly to his feet and stepped out from behind the trough, positioning himself between Felicity and Frank. She wanted to call him back to tell him it wasn't worth it, but the words caught in her throat. "Morning," the cowboy called, his stance relaxed but alert. "Seems to me you're causing a disturbance in this fine town." Frank's head snapped toward the newcomer, his eyes narrowing. "This ain't your business, stranger. Walk away while you still can." "Well now, when a man starts shooting at an unarmed woman in broad daylight, I tend to make it my business." The cowboy didn't raise his voice, but it carried down the street clearly. "The lady doesn't seem interested in your company." Frank's face darkened with rage. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." "Funny," the cowboy replied. "I was about to say the same to you." Felicity watched in horror as Frank's grip tightened on his revolver. She knew what was coming. She'd seen it before: Frank's temper, his speed with a gun, the aftermath of his violence. She wanted to shout a warning, but it was already happening. Frank drew first, his movement a blur of motion. But somehow, impossibly, the cowboy was faster. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, the sounds blending into one extended explosion that reverberated off the buildings lining the street. Frank staggered backward, a look of shock crossing his face before he collapsed into the dirt. The cowboy remained standing, a thin trail of smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. For a moment, no one moved. Then the cowboy holstered his weapon and turned back to Felicity, extending a hand to help her up from behind the trough. "Name's Henry Vance," he said simply. "Looks like you could use some help, madam." Felicity stared at his outstretched hand, then at Frank's motionless form in the street, unable to believe what had just happened. For 2 years, she'd lived in fear, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for Frank to appear. And now, in the span of seconds, a stranger had ended that nightmare. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the question. Henry glanced over his shoulder. "No, madam, shot hit his shoulder. He'll live, though I reckon he might wish otherwise when the law gets through with him. Town sheriff's coming now." Sure enough, a stocky man wearing a tarnished silver star was hurrying toward them, flanked by 2 deputies. People were beginning to emerge from the buildings, murmuring among themselves as they took in the scene. "Felicity Collins," she said finally, taking Henry's hand. "And I think you just saved my life, Mr. Vance." His hand was warm and calloused, engulfing her smaller one completely. "Henry will do just fine," he replied, "and I suspect there's quite a story behind all this." Before she could respond, the sheriff reached them, looking from Frank's groaning form to Henry with obvious suspicion. "What in tarnation happened here?" he demanded. "Self-defense, Sheriff," Henry replied calmly. "Man drew on me after taking a shot at the lady." Plenty of witnesses to back that up. Several nods from the gathering crowd seemed to confirm his statement. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Felicity, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're the new waitress at Mary's Cafe, ain't you?" When she nodded, he continued, "And what's your connection to this fella?" He jerked his thumb toward Frank, who was now being tended to by one of the deputies. "He's—" Felicity hesitated, the weight of her history with Frank suddenly heavy on her shoulders. "He's been pursuing me across 3 states, Sheriff. There's a warrant for him in Colorado for assault. He nearly killed me last year." The sheriff's expression changed, his eyes softening slightly. "Well, Miss Collins, I think you'd better come down to the office and make a statement." "You too, Mr. Vance," Henry supplied, "and I'll be happy to tell you what happened." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Felicity found herself stealing glances at the man who had so casually stepped between her and danger. He walked with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations, but there was nothing arrogant in his demeanor. He caught her looking and offered a reassuring smile that, for the first time, reached his eyes. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "Frank Donovan won't be troubling you anymore." Something in his tone made her believe him, and for the first time in 2 years, Felicity felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. The sheriff's office was a simple wooden structure with a desk, a few chairs, and 2 cells in the back. Frank had been taken to the doctor's office under guard, leaving the 3 of them alone. Sheriff Thomas Wilson, as he introduced himself, properly settled behind his desk and pulled out a notebook. "Now then," he said, dipping his pen in ink, "let's start at the beginning." For the next hour, Felicity recounted her history with Frank Donovan, how they'd met in Denver when she was working as a schoolteacher. His initial charm giving way to possessiveness, and then violence when she refused his proposal. She spoke of her escape in the dead of night, the towns she'd passed through, always looking over her shoulder, and finally her arrival in Cody 6 months ago, hoping the remote Wyoming town would be far enough away from Frank's reach. "I should have known better," she concluded, her hands twisting in her lap. "He told me once he'd follow me to the ends of the earth." Sheriff Wilson nodded gravely. "Men like that don't give up easily," he agreed. "But you say there's a warrant for him in Colorado?" "Yes, sir, in Denver." The charges were assault and attempted murder. "I'll send a wire to the Denver authorities today," Wilson said, making a note. "In the meantime, he'll be staying in our jail once Doc Patterson patches him up." Henry, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "What about Miss Collins' safety?" "If this Donovan is as determined as he seems, a jail cell might not stop him for long." The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "You're right about that. The trial might not happen for weeks, especially if we have to wait for paperwork from Colorado." He turned to Felicity. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay, Miss Collins? Someone who can look out for you?" Felicity shook her head. She lived in a small room above the cafe where she worked. Mary Hollister, the owner, was kind but elderly, hardly someone who could protect her if Frank somehow escaped. "I've got a small ranch about 3 miles outside of town," Henry said unexpectedly. "It's not much, but there's a spare room. My foreman's wife, Sarah, lives on the property too. It would be a safer place for Miss Collins until this matter is resolved." Felicity stared at him in surprise. "Mr. Vance, I couldn't possibly impose, it's no imposition," he cut in gently. "And it's the sensible thing to do. A man like Donovan might have friends and you'd be easier to find in town." Sheriff Wilson nodded in agreement. "That's not a bad idea, Miss Collins. Henry here is one of the most respected ranchers in the county. You'd be safe at his place." Felicity looked between the two men, uncertain. She barely knew Henry Vance, had only met him when he stepped between her and Frank's bullet. Yet something in his steady gaze made her trust him instinctively. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an inconvenience," she said hesitantly. "Not at all," Henry replied. "Sarah will be glad for the company. She's always saying the place needs a woman's touch." And so it was decided. Felicity would pack her things and move to Henry's ranch temporarily, at least until Frank's fate was determined. Sheriff Wilson promised to keep them informed of any developments and escorted them back outside. The street had returned to normal, the only evidence of the morning's drama a dark stain in the dust where Frank had fallen. Felicity shuddered at the sight. "I'll need to let Mary know I won't be coming to work," she said, glancing toward the cafe. "We can stop there on our way," Henry agreed. "I've got my wagon at the Mercantile. Do you have much to pack?" "Just a trunk," Felicity replied. "I've learned to travel light these past 2 years." There was something sad in that simple statement that made Henry's expression soften. "Well, maybe you won't need to run anymore." As they walked toward the cafe, Felicity found herself studying her unlikely protector more carefully. Henry Vance was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked outdoors. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and squinting against harsh weather. His dark hair was a bit too long, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and there was a small scar just above his left eyebrow. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, though there was a weariness in his eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his share of hardship. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Going on 5 years now," Henry replied. "It's not the biggest spread in the county, but it's mine. 50 head of cattle, a few horses, enough to get by." "And you're from Wyoming originally?" A slight hesitation. "No, madam, originally from Texas. Came north after the war." The war had ended 20 years ago, Felicity realized. Henry would have been just a boy then. There was clearly more to his story, but she sensed it wasn't something he cared to discuss with a virtual stranger. She respected that. She had her own secrets, after all. Mary Hollister took the news of Felicity's temporary departure with understanding once she heard the full story. "That Frank fellow came in here twice, asking about you," she admitted. "Something about him didn't sit right with me. I told him I didn't know anyone by your name." "Thank you, Mary," Felicity said gratefully. "I'm sorry to leave you short-handed." The older woman waved away her concern. "Your safety matters more than serving coffee. You come back when it's all settled, you hear? Your job will be waiting." With Mary's blessing, Felicity hurried upstairs to pack her belongings. It didn't take long. As she'd told Henry, she traveled light. Everything she owned fit into a single trunk. A few dresses, undergarments, a spare pair of boots, a hairbrush and mirror, a small box of letters from her late parents, and a worn copy of Jane Eyre, her favorite book. The trappings of a life kept purposely simple, easy to abandon at a moment's notice. As she closed the trunk, Felicity caught her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. She looked tired, she realized, with dark circles under her blue eyes and a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before Frank Donovan came into her life. At 24, she felt decades older, worn down by fear and flight. But for the first time in years, there was a flicker of something else in her expression. Hope, perhaps, or at least the absence of immediate terror. She brushed a strand of honey-blonde hair from her face and squared her shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least she wasn't alone in facing it. Henry was waiting patiently downstairs, his wagon now parked in front of the cafe. He loaded her trunk with ease, then helped her onto the wooden seat beside him. "We'll stop by the Mercantile," he said as he flicked the reins to set the horses in motion. I need to pick up some supplies, and Sarah asked me to get flour and sugar. Felicity nodded, suddenly conscious of how this must appear to the townspeople watching them depart together. A single woman going to live on the ranch of a man she just met it would set tongues wagging, regardless of the circumstances. But gossip seemed a small price to pay for safety. The mercantile was busy with the usual Saturday crowd. As they entered, several people turned to stare, news of the morning's confrontation having spread through town. Henry ignored the looks, greeting the storekeeper with a nod. Afternoon, Jim. Need the usual plus 20 pounds of flour and 10 of sugar. While Jim gathered their order, Felicity found herself drawn to a display of fabrics. She ran her fingers over a bolt of soft blue cotton, similar to the dress now stained with water and dirt from her hiding place behind the trough. That would suit you, Henry remarked, coming to stand beside her. Brings out the color of your eyes. Felicity withdrew her hand quickly, her cheeks warming. I wasn't planning to buy it, she said, just looking. Henry studied her for a moment, then turned to the storekeeper. Jim, add 5 yards of that blue cotton to my order. Mr. Vance, you don't need to, Felicity began to protest. Consider it compensation for your ruined dress, Henry said. Saw the state of it when you stood up from behind that trough, least I can do. Before she could argue further, Jim was already cutting the fabric. Felicity sighed in defeat, but couldn't help feeling a small thrill at the prospect of a new dress. It had been so long since she'd had anything new that wasn't an absolute necessity. Thank you, she said quietly. It's very kind of you. Henry merely nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. We should get going. It's a fair ride to the ranch, and I'd like to arrive before dark. They loaded the supplies into the wagon, and Henry helped Felicity back onto the seat. As they pulled away from the mercantile, she caught sight of several women watching them with obvious interest. By tomorrow, the story would have spread throughout Cody the waitress, the gunslinger, and their departure together. Felicity sighed inwardly. She'd just have to endure the gossip until Frank's situation was resolved. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling prairie dotted with sagebrush, backed by the distant mountains that gave this part of Wyoming its distinctive beauty. After the tension of the morning, the wide open spaces felt liberating to Felicity. It's beautiful out here, she commented as they traveled along the dusty road. Henry nodded. That's why I stayed. Meant to just pass through on my way further west, but something about this country gets under your skin. How did you end up ranching? She asked, genuinely curious. Henry was silent for a moment, as if considering how much to share. Worked as a trail hand for years, he finally said. Drove cattle up from Texas 6 times. Last outfit I worked for had a spread near Cody. The owner, Old Man Jenkins, had no sons, just a daughter who'd married a banker in Cheyenne. When he died, she wanted to sell. I'd saved most of my wages over the years, made her an offer on the smaller section of the property. Been building it up since then. That's impressive, Felicity said, building something from nothing. A faint smile crossed Henry's face. Still building, ranch like mine is never really finished. What about family? The question slipped out before she could stop herself. I'm sorry, that's too personal. It's all right, Henry replied, his eyes on the road ahead. No family to speak of. Parents died when I was young, had a brother, but he didn't make it back from the war. He glanced at her. What about you? Anyone who might be missing you somewhere? Felicity shook her head. My parents passed away 5 years ago within months of each other, influenza. I was teaching school in Denver when it happened. No siblings. That's partly why it was so easy for Frank too. She trailed off, not wanting to revisit those memories. To isolate you, Henry finished. Men like him look for women without family connections, makes it easier for them to control. Felicity looked at him in surprise. You seem to understand a great deal about men like Frank. Seen my share, Henry replied grimly. The kind who mistake fear for respect, who build themselves up by tearing others down. They're all cut from the same cloth. They fell into a companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rolled across the Wyoming countryside. After about an hour, Henry pointed toward a distant collection of buildings nestled against a gentle slope. "That's it," he said. "Not much to look at, but it's home." As they drew closer, Felicity could make out a modest but well-maintained ranch house, a large barn, a bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. A corral held several horses, and beyond that, she could see cattle grazing on the open range. It wasn't the largest ranch she'd ever seen, but there was something inviting about its proportions, a human scale that spoke of hard work rather than grandeur. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on an apron. She was middle-aged, with graying red hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she watched their arrival with obvious curiosity. "That's Sarah," Henry explained. "Her husband Tom is my foreman. They've been with the ranch since I bought it. Good people." He drew the wagon to a halt in front of the house and jumped down, then helped Felicity descend. Sarah approached, her friendly face alight with questions. "Henry Vance, you've been gone since dawn, and you return with a lady friend and no explanation," she said, her tone gently teasing. "Sarah, this is Miss Felicity Collins," Henry said. "She's going to be staying with us for a while. Miss Collins, this is Sarah Blackwood, the real boss of this operation." Sarah laughed at that, extending a work-worn hand to Felicity. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Collins." "Don't mind Henry's nonsense. Tom and I just keep things running when he's away." "Please call me Felicity," she replied, taking the offered hand. "And I'm very grateful for your hospitality." Sarah's eyes darted between them, clearly bursting with questions but too polite to ask them outright. Henry seemed to take pity on her. "There was some trouble in town," he explained. "Miss Collins needs a safe place to stay until it's resolved. I thought the spare room would suit her." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "Of course," she said warmly. "We'd be happy to have you, Felicity." "That room's been empty too long anyway." She turned to Henry. "I'll get her settled while you and Tom unload the supplies." Henry nodded, looking relieved to have the social niceties handled by Sarah. "I'll bring your trunk in, Miss Collins." As he moved to the back of the wagon, Sarah linked her arm through Felicity's and led her toward the house. "Don't worry about explaining anything if you don't want to," she said quietly. "Everyone's entitled to their secrets around here." The simple kindness in her voice nearly undid Felicity. After months of looking over her shoulder, of trusting no one completely, Sarah's easy acceptance was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed. It's been a difficult day." Sarah patted her arm. "Well, you're safe now." Henry Vance might not say much, but once he gives his word to protect someone, nothing on earth could make him break it. As they entered the house, Felicity found herself hoping that Sarah was right. Because despite the distance they'd put between themselves and town, she couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles with Frank Donovan were far from over. The interior of the ranch house was simpler than Felicity had expected, but comfortable and immaculately clean. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace along one wall and a solid wooden table with 6 chairs at the other. Braided rag rugs softened the plank floors, and the windows were hung with faded but clean gingham curtains. "It's not fancy," Sarah said, noticing Felicity's inspection, "but it's home." "It's lovely," Felicity replied honestly. There was a warmth to the place that had nothing to do with furnishings and everything to do with the people who lived there. Sarah led her down a short hallway. "Kitchen's through there," she said, pointing to an open doorway. "Henry's room is at the end of the hall. This will be yours." She opened a door to reveal a small but pleasant bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and a small window looked out toward the mountains. "I'll fetch fresh water for the pitcher," Sarah said. "There's a shelf in the kitchen cupboard where you can keep your personal things, and we usually bathe in the wash house out back, more privacy there than trying to manage in these little rooms." "It's perfect," Felicity assured her. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this." Heavy footsteps in the hallway announced Henry's arrival with her trunk. He set it at the foot of the bed, then straightened, looking somewhat awkward in the small room. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes, thank you," Felicity said. "Sarah's been very welcoming." "Good," he replied, seeming relieved. "I'll let you get settled then. Supper's usually at 6, but we can wait if you need to rest." "6 is fine," Felicity said. "I'd like to help if that's all right." Sarah beamed at that. "Another pair of hands is always welcome in the kitchen." "Come find me when you're ready." The two left her alone, and Felicity sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The events of the morning seemed surreal now, as if they had happened to someone else. Frank shooting at her, Henry's intervention, the confrontation in the street, and now here she was, miles from town in the home of a man she barely knew. She should have been frightened, or at least wary, but all she felt was a profound relief. For the first time in years, she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for Frank to appear. The walls around her felt solid and secure, and outside them were people who, for whatever reason, seemed determined to protect her. Felicity unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses on the pegs provided and placing her personal items on the washstand. The room began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a space of her own. When she'd finished, she splashed water on her face from the pitcher Sarah had brought, smoothed her hair, and went to find the kitchen. She found Sarah kneading bread dough at a large table, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, flour dusting her forearms. The older woman looked up with a smile. "There you are. Feel free to tie on an apron and help yourself to the potato bin. 6 men to feed tonight, Henry, Tom, and 4 hands from the bunkhouse. They'll be hungry as wolves after a day's work." Felicity gladly complied, finding comfort in the familiar routine of kitchen work. As they prepared the meal together, Sarah chatted easily about the ranch, the people, and the community around Cody. She didn't ask about Felicity's circumstances, for which Felicity was grateful. "How long have you and Tom been married?" Felicity asked as she peeled potatoes. 26 years come August," Sarah replied, her hands never stopping their rhythmic kneading. "Met him when I was 17 and he was working my father's farm in Nebraska. Knew right away he was the one for me." "That's a long time," Felicity said, trying to imagine such stability. Her own experience with men had left her doubtful that such lasting happiness was possible. "Has its ups and downs like anything else," Sarah admitted, "but when you find the right one, you work through the hard times." She glanced at Felicity. "You ever been married, if you don't mind my asking?" "No," Felicity said, her hands stilling momentarily on the potato she was peeling. "There was someone once, but it didn't work out," Sarah nodded, not pressing further. "Well, you're young yet, plenty of time." Felicity wasn't so sure about that. At 24, with her history, she sometimes felt her chances for a normal life, marriage, children, a home of her own, had slipped away. But she didn't share these thoughts with Sarah. As they continued working, they heard the sound of men's voices approaching the house. "That'll be Tom and the others," Sarah said, setting the bread dough aside to rise. "They always wash up at the pump before coming in. Henry's got strict rules about that no-trail dust at his table." Sure enough, a few minutes later the door opened and 5 men filed in, their faces and hands scrubbed clean, though their clothes still bore the evidence of a day's hard work. Tom Blackwood was easily identifiable by the way he immediately moved to Sarah's side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He was a tall, rangy man with a weathered face and kind eyes. The other 3 were ranch hands of varying ages, all of whom regarded Felicity with undisguised curiosity. Henry introduced them briefly: Bill, the oldest at around 50, Miguel, a young Mexican cowboy, and Charlie, a freckle-faced youth who couldn't be more than 19. All 3 nodded politely to Felicity before taking their places at the table. Henry, she noticed, had changed his shirt and combed his hair. He held out a chair for her beside his own at the head of the table. "Hope Sarah didn't work you too hard," he said with a slight smile. "Not at all," Felicity replied. "It was nice to be useful." The meal was simple but hearty roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, and green beans preserved from last summer's garden. The men ate with the focused appreciation of those who'd worked hard all day, while conversation flowed easily around the table. Felicity was relieved to find that no one asked about her presence. Either Henry had explained the situation already, or they were following his lead in respecting her privacy. As they ate, she learned more about the ranch and its operations. They were preparing for spring roundup, when the calves born over the winter would be counted, branded, and the young steers castrated. It was one of the busiest times of the year, with all hands working from dawn to dusk. Miss Collins used to be a school teacher, Henry mentioned during a lull in the conversation, in Denver. Is that so? Tom said, looking at her with new interest. We've been talking about starting a school here in the valley. Got enough children among the ranches now to warrant one, but no teacher. It's just talk at this point, Sarah added quickly, perhaps sensing Felicity's discomfort. Nothing settled. I enjoyed teaching, Felicity said carefully, but that was before. Henry seemed to sense her unease and changed the subject, asking Tom about a section of fence that needed repair. The conversation shifted safely back to ranch business, and Felicity found herself relaxing again. After the meal, the hands thanked Sarah for the food and filed out to the bunkhouse. Tom lingered to help his wife clear the table, and Felicity immediately joined in, gathering plates and carrying them to the wash basin. You don't need to do that, Henry said, rising to stop her. You're a guest here. I'd prefer to help, Felicity insisted. I'm not used to sitting idle. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. As you wish, but tomorrow you rest. It's been a long day for you. Felicity couldn't argue with that. As the adrenaline of the day faded, exhaustion was settling deep into her bones. By the time the kitchen was clean, she was struggling to keep her eyes open. Off to bed with you, Sarah said kindly, noticing her fatigue. Everything will look brighter in the morning. Felicity didn't need much convincing. She bid everyone good night and retreated to her room, where she changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come immediately. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day Frank's appearance, the shot that nearly killed her, Henry's intervention, and the journey to this ranch that now sheltered her. She wondered what would happen to Frank. Would the Colorado authorities come for him? Would he stand trial in Wyoming for attempting to kill her today? And what if he somehow escaped or was released? He would come for her again. Of that, she had no doubt. Eventually, sheer exhaustion overcame her worries, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Felicity woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the distant sounds of ranch activity already in progress. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-fogged mind. Then the previous day's events came rushing back, and she sat up abruptly. A quick glance at the small clock on the washstand told her it was past 8 much later than she usually slept. Embarrassed at her laziness, she hurried to dress in one of her simpler dresses, a brown calico suitable for everyday wear. She brushed and pinned her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, then made her way to the kitchen. Sarah was there, washing dishes, and turned with a smile when Felicity entered. Good morning. I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away, not that anyone would blame you after yesterday. I'm so sorry, Felicity said, mortified. I never sleep this late. You should have woken me. Nonsense, Sarah replied firmly. You needed the rest. There's coffee on the stove and biscuits keeping warm in the oven. Help yourself. Felicity did as she was told, grateful for the strong, hot coffee. Where is everyone? She asked, noticing the quiet of the house. Out working since dawn, Sarah replied. Henry and Tom took the hands to the north pasture to check on some new calves. They'll be back for dinner at midday. She wiped her hands on her apron. Which reminds me, I need to get bread started if we're going to have enough for everyone. Let me help, Felicity offered immediately. For the rest of the morning, she worked alongside Sarah in companionable productivity. They baked bread, prepared a large pot of beef stew for the midday meal, and churned butter from the cream of the ranch's small dairy herd. Felicity found the work soothing, a welcome distraction from her worries about Frank. "You're good in the kitchen," Sarah commented as they worked. "Most school teachers I've known barely know one end of a spoon from the other." Felicity smiled at that. "My mother insisted I learn all the domestic arts, even while I was studying to be a teacher. She said education was important, but a woman should know how to run a household too." "Smart woman, your mother," Sarah said approvingly. "Too many girls these days think fine clothes and fancy manners are all they need." By midday, the men returned, bringing with them the earthy scents of horses, cattle, and honest sweat. They washed up outside before entering the house and once again gathered around the large table for the main meal of the day. Henry took his place at the head of the table with Felicity beside him. "Sleep well?" he asked as he passed her the bread basket. "Yes, thank you," she replied. "Though I'm sorry to have risen so late." "No need to apologize. After what you've been through, you're entitled to rest." The meal proceeded much like the previous nights, with conversation revolving around ranch business. Felicity was content to listen, finding comfort in the normal rhythms of these people's lives. It was only when the hands had returned to work, and Sarah and Tom had gone to the vegetable garden, that Henry broached the subject of her situation. "I'll be riding into town tomorrow," he said as they sat at the cleared table, finishing their coffee. "Need to check with the sheriff about Donovan." Felicity tensed at the mention of Frank's name. "Do you think? Could he have escaped somehow?" "Unlikely," Henry replied. "Wilson's a good sheriff, and Donovan's injury would slow him down even if he managed to break out. But I want to know what's happening with the charges, whether they've heard from the Colorado authorities yet. Should I come with you?" Felicity asked, though the thought of returning to town and potentially seeing Frank again made her stomach clench with fear. Henry shook his head. "Better if you stay here for now. I'll bring back any news." She nodded, relieved. "Thank you, for everything, I mean. Taking me in, protecting me, you had no reason to get involved in my troubles." He looked at her for a long moment, his green eyes serious. "Some things a man can't walk away from, Miss Collins. Some wrongs need righting." There was something in his tone that suggested he'd faced such choices before, perhaps made different decisions than the one he'd made yesterday when he stepped between her and Frank. Felicity wanted to ask about his past, to understand what had shaped this quiet, capable man, but she sensed it wasn't the time. Instead, she said simply, "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons." Henry nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He rose from the table. "I should get back to work. The north fence won't fix itself." After he'd gone, Felicity helped Sarah with the remaining household chores, then asked if there was something else she could do to contribute. Sarah hesitated, then gestured to a basket of mending in the corner. "If you've a hand for sewing, that pile's been growing for weeks. I never seem to find the time between cooking and cleaning and the garden." Felicity took up the basket gladly. Sewing had always been soothing to her, the repetitive motion of the needle allowing her mind to wander or rest as needed. She settled in a chair by the window, where the afternoon light would aid her work, and began sorting through the items: shirts with missing buttons, socks with holes, a pair of trousers with a torn knee. As she worked, her thoughts returned to her situation. What would happen when Frank's case was resolved, one way or another? She couldn't stay at the ranch indefinitely. Eventually, she would need to return to town, to her job at the cafe, to her small room above it. Or perhaps she should move on again, find another town, another temporary home. The thought brought a surprising pang of regret. Despite everything, she'd come to like Cody and its people. And now there was Henry and his ranch, where she'd found unexpected sanctuary, but what alternative was there? She had no family, no home of her own, just the skills she could trade for wages and the few possessions she could carry in her trunk. It was a precarious existence, one that left her vulnerable to men like Frank Donovan. She was so absorbed in these thoughts that she didn't hear Sarah return from the garden until the older woman spoke. "You've made good progress," she said, nodding at the pile of mended clothes beside Felicity. "Henry's shirts haven't looked that neat since he bought them." Felicity smiled, holding up the shirt she'd just finished. The stitching on the cuff was coming loose as well as the missing buttons. "I reinforced it while I was at it." Sarah took the shirt, examining the neat stitches with approval. "He works those shirts hard. Wears them till they're more patch than original fabric." She looked at Felicity thoughtfully. "He's a good man, you know, the best I've known besides my Tom." "I'm beginning to see that," Felicity admitted, "though I still don't understand why he was willing to risk his life for a stranger." Sarah folded the shirt carefully. "Henry's got his reasons for standing up to bullies. Not my story to tell, mind you, but let's just say he knows what it means to be powerless against someone stronger." Before Felicity could ask more, the door opened and Tom entered, his expression unusually grave. "Sheriff's here," he said to Sarah. "Wants to talk to Henry and Miss Collins." Felicity's heart lurched. Had something happened with Frank? Had he somehow escaped? "Henry's at the north fence," Sarah replied. "Miguel just rode out to fetch him." "I'll wait with the sheriff," Tom said, then turned to Felicity. "Don't worry, Miss Collins. Whatever it is, you're safe here." Felicity nodded, but couldn't speak past the knot of fear in her throat. She set aside the mending and followed Tom outside, where Sheriff Wilson was waiting beside his horse. He removed his hat when he saw her. "Miss Collins," he greeted her soberly. "Sorry to disturb you out here." Is it about Frank?" she managed to ask. The sheriff nodded. "Afraid so. But it might be better to wait for Henry before we get into it." Those words did nothing to calm her fears. Felicity clasped her hands tightly to keep them from trembling, trying to prepare herself for whatever news the sheriff had brought. Had Frank escaped? Had he hurt someone else? The possibilities multiplied in her mind, each worse than the last. It was nearly 20 minutes before Henry arrived, riding hard from the north pasture, Miguel trailing behind him. He dismounted quickly, handing the reins to Miguel before approaching the sheriff. "Wilson," he said tersely. "What brings you out here?" "News about Donovan," the sheriff replied. "Thought you'd both want to know right away." Henry's gaze flicked to Felicity, concern evident in his eyes. "Let's talk inside." They moved into the house, where Sarah quickly provided coffee for the sheriff. Once they were all seated at the table, Wilson got to the point. "Donovan's dead," he said bluntly. Felicity gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Dead? But how?" "Found him this morning in his cell," the sheriff explained. "Hung himself with his belt. Must have happened sometime in the night. Deputy found him when he brought breakfast." Silence fell over the table as they absorbed this news. Felicity felt numb, unable to reconcile the Frank she knew violent, determined, obsessive with someone who would take his own life. "Are you sure it was suicide?" Henry asked, voicing her own doubts. The sheriff sighed. "As sure as I can be. Cell was locked, no signs of anyone else having been there, and—" He hesitated, glancing at Felicity. "Go on," she said quietly. "He left a note," Wilson said reluctantly. "Addressed to you, Miss Collins." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Felicity stared at it, making no move to take it. "What does it say?" she whispered. The sheriff unfolded the paper, his expression uncomfortable. "It says, if I can't have you, no one will. I'll be watching from hell." A cold shiver ran through Felicity. Even in death, Frank was trying to control her, to frighten her. "May I see it?" Henry asked. Wilson handed him the note. Henry studied it for a moment, then passed it to Felicity without comment. She took it reluctantly, recognizing Frank's angular handwriting. The message was exactly as the sheriff had read it, the words like a final threat reaching out from beyond the grave. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "That's it," Wilson replied. "Case closed. Donovan's body will be buried in the town cemetery unless there's family somewhere who wants to claim it. He has a brother in St. Louis," Felicity said, the information surfacing from some distant conversation. "But I don't know how to contact him." The sheriff nodded. "I'll send a wire, see if we can track him down. In the meantime, you're free to return to town whenever you like, Miss Collins. The danger's past. Had it, though? Felicity wondered. The note suggested otherwise, as if Frank's malevolence might somehow reach beyond death itself. It was irrational, she knew, but the fear felt real. Henry seemed to sense her unease. Miss Collins is welcome to stay here as long as she needs, he said to the sheriff. No rush to decide anything today. Wilson nodded, rising from his seat. Well, I should get back. Paperwork to file on all this. He turned to Felicity. I am sorry for the distress this has caused you, madam. No woman should have to deal with a man like Donovan. After the sheriff had departed, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Sarah busied herself clearing away the coffee cups, while Tom excused himself to return to work. Henry remained at the table with Felicity, who still held Frank's note in her trembling hand. Are you all right? Henry asked quietly. Felicity looked down at the paper, then deliberately tore it in half and then in quarters. I think so, she said. It's just, I never expected it to end this way. How did you think it would end? His voice was gentle, without judgment. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose I thought I'd keep running and he'd keep following until… She couldn't finish the sentence. Until one of you couldn't run anymore, Henry completed for her. She nodded, the truth of it settling heavily on her shoulders. Is it wrong that I feel relieved? That he's gone, that I don't have to be afraid anymore? No, Henry said firmly. It's not wrong. What's wrong is that he made you afraid in the first place. Felicity looked up at him, struck by the certainty in his tone. You really believe that? I do, he replied. A man who uses fear to control others isn't much of a man at all. There was that hint again of personal experience, of wounds not fully healed. Felicity wondered about Henry's past, what had shaped his convictions, but this wasn't the moment to ask. The sheriff said I could return to town, she said instead. I should probably let you and Sarah get back to your normal routines. Henry studied her for a moment. Do you want to go back? The question caught her off guard. Did she? The thought of returning to her small room, to the routine of the cafe, held less appeal than it might have before. I don't know, she admitted. I have my job at the cafe, but beyond that. No rush to decide, Henry said. Like I told Wilson, you're welcome here as long as you need. He rose from the table. I should get back to the fence. Take some time to think about what you want to do next. After he'd gone, Felicity sat at the table, turning over her options in her mind. For 2 years, her life had been defined by running from Frank. Now that he was gone, she felt oddly directionless, as if she'd been so focused on escape that she'd forgotten how to simply live. Sarah returned from the pantry, where she'd been giving them privacy, and sat across from Felicity. Henry's right, you know, there's no hurry to leave. In fact. She hesitated, then continued, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Oh, Felicity looked up, curious. Tom and I aren't getting any younger, Sarah said. Running this house, cooking for all these men, keeping the garden, it's getting to be a bit much for me alone. I've been thinking for a while that we could use another pair of hands around here permanently. Felicity stared at her, not quite comprehending. Are you offering me a job? More like a position, Sarah clarified. Room and board plus wages, helping me with the house and garden. It would free me up to spend more time with the chickens and dairy cows, which is what I really enjoy anyway. She smiled. You're good in the kitchen, you sew better than I ever could, and you've got a way about you that settles the men at mealtimes. They're less rowdy when there's a lady present who isn't old enough to be their mother. The offer was unexpected, and Felicity found herself genuinely considering it. The ranch felt safe in a way town hadn't for a long time. The work would be similar to what she did at the cafe, but with the added benefit of not having to interact with strangers all day. And she'd grown fond of Sarah in the short time she'd known her. What does Henry think of this idea? She asked. It was his suggestion, actually, Sarah replied. Last night, after you'd gone to bed, said it made sense to have more help in the house, especially with Roundup coming and extra hands to feed. She paused. Though between you and me, I think he might have other reasons for wanting you to stay. Felicity felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to sound dignified. Sarah laughed. "Don't worry, I won't embarrass you further, just think about the offer. No need to decide right away." But as the day progressed, Felicity found herself leaning more and more toward accepting. She helped Sarah prepare supper, feeling a growing sense of place and purpose that had been missing from her life for too long. When the men came in for the evening meal, she found herself watching Henry, the quiet authority with which he led the conversation, the respect his men clearly had for him, the way his eyes occasionally sought hers across the table. There was something there, a connection she hadn't expected to form with anyone after Frank. Not attraction exactly, or not just attraction, but a sense of safety and potential that both thrilled and frightened her. After the meal, when the hands had returned to the bunkhouse, and Sarah and Tom had retired to their quarters behind the kitchen, Henry asked Felicity to join him on the porch. The spring evening was mild, with a crescent moon rising over the eastern hills and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, a distant coyote, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the creak of the windmill turning in the light breeze. "Sarah mentioned her offer to you," Henry said finally. Felicity nodded. "She did." "It's very generous. But," he caught the hesitation in her voice, "but I'm not sure it's right for me to accept charity," she replied honestly. "You and Sarah have already done so much." Henry turned to look at her directly. "It's not charity, Miss Collins. Sarah needs the help, that's the honest truth. She works too hard, has for years. Having another woman in the house would ease her burden considerably." "And what about you?" Felicity asked, gathering her courage. "Would you be comfortable having me here permanently?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I wouldn't have suggested it to Sarah if I wasn't." "So it was your idea," she said, remembering Sarah's words. "The position needed filling," he replied, neither confirming nor denying. "You seem well suited to it." Felicity considered this. On the surface, it was a practical arrangement, a household that needed help, a woman who needed safe employment. But there was something else beneath the practicality, something neither of them was quite ready to name. "I think I'd like to accept," she said finally, "if you're sure." Henry nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. We can ride into town tomorrow to collect the rest of your things and let Mary know you won't be returning to the cafe." They fell into silence again, but it was a comfortable one, filled with the sense of a decision well made. Felicity felt something settle within her, not just relief at Frank's passing, but a quieter, deeper feeling of having found her place after so long adrift. As the days turned into weeks, Felicity settled into life at the Vance ranch as if she had always belonged there. Her duties were similar to Sarah's: cooking, cleaning, mending, but the older woman had been right about wanting to spend more time with the dairy cows and chickens. With Felicity handling most of the household tasks, Sarah was free to focus on her preferred work, and both women were happier for the arrangement. Spring roundup came and went, bringing with it the controlled chaos of additional ranch hands, long days, and endless meals to prepare. Felicity threw herself into the work, rising before dawn to have breakfast ready for the men and often not finishing the day's tasks until well after dark. But there was satisfaction in the exhaustion, a sense of contributing to something meaningful. Throughout it all, her relationship with Henry evolved gradually from employer and employee to something resembling friendship. He was often busy with ranch work, but in the evenings, they would sometimes sit on the porch together, talking about books they had read, places they had seen, or simply enjoying the peaceful Wyoming night. Felicity learned more about him in these conversations. He had grown up in eastern Texas, the son of a small farmer who barely managed to feed his family. His father had been a hard man, quick with his fists when disappointed or drunk, which was often. Henry's mother had died when he was 10, leaving him and his younger brother to bear the brunt of their father's temper. When the war came, Henry's brother James had enlisted in the Confederate Army at 17, eager to escape home. He never returned, killed at Gettysburg. Henry himself had left home at 16, working his way west with cattle drives, saving every penny he earned with the dream of someday owning his own land. That dream had been realized with the purchase of the ranch, but Felicity sensed it hadn't brought him the satisfaction he'd expected. There was a loneliness in him that matched something in herself. As for Felicity, she found herself sharing parts of her past she'd kept hidden for years. She told Henry about her childhood in St. Louis, the daughter of a bookkeeper and a schoolteacher, her love of learning that had led her to become a teacher herself. She spoke of her parents' deaths and her subsequent move to Denver, where she had met Frank Donovan at a church social. He was charming at first, she admitted one evening as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. Attentive, generous, he courted me properly: flowers, dinners with friends, walks in the park. When he proposed after 6 months, I was flattered, but something held me back from saying yes immediately. Your instincts, Henry said. Warning you, Felicity nodded. I asked for time to consider. That's when things changed. He became possessive, wanted to know where I was every moment, who I was talking to. When I finally refused his proposal, She paused, the memory still painful. He showed me what would happen to women who defied him. Henry's hand clenched on the arm of his chair, but his voice remained steady. And no one helped you. No one stepped in. I had no family, she reminded him, few close friends, and Frank was respected in the community, a successful businessman, generous to the right charities. Who would believe that he was capable of such violence? She shook her head. I didn't even try to tell anyone, I just ran. Until he found you in Cody, Henry concluded. Yes, although in a way I'm glad he did, if he hadn't. She didn't finish the thought, but her eyes met Henry's, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of how their lives had intersected at precisely the right moment. As spring gave way to summer, Felicity found herself thinking of the ranch as home in a way she hadn't experienced since her parents' house in St. Louis. Her room became personalized with small touches: wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, a small rag rug she had braided herself beside the bed, books borrowed from Henry's modest library stacked on the bedside table. She wrote to her former landlady in Denver, asking her to ship a few keepsakes she'd left behind in her hasty departure, and when they arrived, the room felt truly her own. In town, where she occasionally accompanied Henry or Sarah for supplies, people had accepted her new position without much gossip. If anyone wondered about her relationship with Henry, they kept their speculations to themselves, at least in her presence. Mary from the cafe had been disappointed to lose her as a waitress, but understood her reasons for preferring the security of the ranch. It was during one of these trips to town in late July that Felicity received a letter that would change everything. They had stopped at the post office to collect the ranch mail, and the postmaster had called her over. Letter for you, Miss Collins, he said, handing her an envelope. Been holding it for nearly a week. Felicity took it, surprised. She rarely received mail, having lost touch with most of her acquaintances during her years of running. The letter was from Denver, from a law firm she didn't recognize. Puzzled, she tucked it into her pocket to read later. It wasn't until that evening, after supper was cleared away and the house was quiet, that she remembered the letter. Sitting on her bed, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. As she read, her eyes widened in disbelief. According to the lawyers, Frank Donovan had named her as the sole beneficiary in his will, leaving her his entire estate, a substantial sum of money, a house in Denver, and ownership shares in several businesses. The letter explained that while Donovan had changed his will shortly before his death, the document had been properly witnessed and appeared to be legally binding. Felicity let the letter fall to her lap, stunned. Why would Frank leave everything to her? The man had terrorized her, had tried to kill her just before his death. It made no sense, unless it was one final attempt to control her, to force her back to Denver, to the life he had envisioned for them, A soft knock at her door startled her from these thoughts. "Felicity." Henry's voice came through the wood. "Is everything all right?" She realized she must have made some sound of distress that he had heard from the main room. "I'm fine," she called, quickly folding the letter. "Just a moment." She opened the door to find Henry standing there, concern evident in his expression. "Sorry to disturb you," he said. "I thought I heard, 'Never mind if you're all right.'" "Actually," Felicity said, making a sudden decision, "I received some news today. I could use some advice if you have a moment." Henry nodded, and she led him to the porch, where the cool evening air and the privacy of the darkness would make the conversation easier. Once seated, she handed him the letter without comment. He read it silently, his expression gradually shifting from confusion to disbelief. When he looked up, his eyes sought hers in the dim light from the windows. "Donovan left you everything?" "It seems so," Felicity replied, still struggling to make sense of it herself. "Though I can't imagine why." Henry refolded the letter carefully. "What will you do?" It was the question she'd been asking herself since reading the news. The inheritance would make her financially independent, something few women of her acquaintance could claim. She could go anywhere, do anything. She could return to teaching or travel or simply live comfortably without working at all. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants nothing to do with it with anything connected to Frank, but another part thinks it might be a kind of justice. Using his money to build the life he tried to prevent me from having." Henry was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable in the shadows. "The lawyers will need an answer," he said finally. "Whether you'll accept the inheritance." "Yes," she agreed. "I should write to them tomorrow." "And if you do accept," he continued, his voice carefully neutral, "I assume you'll be returning to Denver to manage your affairs." The thought hadn't occurred to Felicity, but of course it made sense. There would be papers to sign, properties to inspect, businesses to oversee. She couldn't do that from Wyoming. "I suppose I would need to, at least temporarily," she said slowly. The prospect of returning to Denver, where so many painful memories awaited, filled her with dread. Yet the opportunity to secure her future was too significant to ignore. Henry stood abruptly. "It's getting late. You should rest. Think about it with a clear head in the morning." His sudden withdrawal confused her. "Henry, is something wrong?" He paused, his back to her. "Nothing's wrong. You've been given an opportunity most people only dream of. You should take it." There was something in his tone, a resignation, a finality that alarmed her. "You make it sound as if I've already decided to leave and never return." He turned to face her, his expression softened by the moonlight. "Haven't you? What's here that could compare to what awaits you in Denver?" The question hung between them, laden with meanings neither had acknowledged aloud. Felicity rose to stand before him, suddenly certain of her answer. "Everything," she said softly. "Everything that matters is here." Henry's breath caught visibly. "Felicity," he began, but she placed her fingers gently over his lips. "I've spent 2 years running from the past," she said. "I'm not going to run toward it now, not when I've finally found a place where I belong." His hand came up to capture hers, drawing it away from his face but not releasing it. "And where is that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Where do you belong, Felicity Collins?" She met his gaze steadily. "Here, Henry, with you, if you want me to stay." The confession hung in the air between them, a truth finally spoken after months of careful friendship. Henry's grip on her hand tightened, and he drew her closer slowly, as if giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Felicity had no desire to retreat. She stepped willingly into his embrace, tilting her face up to his. "I want you to stay," he whispered, just before his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. Felicity answered by winding her arms around his neck, pressing closer, deepening the connection. Henry responded in kind, his hands spanning her waist, holding her as if she were precious and fragile. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. "I've wanted to do that since the day I met you," Henry admitted, resting his forehead against hers. Felicity laughed softly. "Even with bullets flying and Frank trying to kill us both, Even then, he confirmed. Maybe especially then. You were so brave, so determined, I knew right away you were someone special. The admission warmed her heart. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first day too, she confessed. But I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. After Frank, I wasn't sure I could trust my judgment about men. And now, Henry asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Now I know the difference between a man who wants to possess me and one who wants to protect me, she replied. Between someone who uses fear to control and someone who offers safety without demands. She touched his face gently. I trust you, Henry Vance, with my heart, with my future. He turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. I don't have much to offer compared to what's waiting for you in Denver, he said, just a small ranch and a man who loves you. That's all I want, Felicity assured him, all I need. They stayed on the porch for hours, talking about the future, making plans. Felicity would go to Denver, but only long enough to settle the estate and arrange for the sale of Frank's properties. She would accept the inheritance, as Henry pointed out. It was a fitting irony that Frank's money would now give her the freedom he had tried to deny her in life. But she would return to Cody, to the ranch, to Henry, and when she did, they would be married. The decision came naturally, without grand proposals or hesitation. Both had endured enough loneliness to recognize the rare gift they had found in each other, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared understanding, and genuine love. The next morning, Felicity wrote to the lawyers in Denver, accepting the inheritance and informing them she would arrive within the month to handle the necessary arrangements. She also wrote to her former landlady, asking her to find temporary accommodations for her upcoming stay. When she announced her plans at breakfast, Sarah's face fell with disappointment until Felicity hastily explained that she would be returning to the ranch as Henry's wife. The older woman's expression transformed instantly to delight, and she rose to embrace them both. It's about time. She exclaimed, I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. Tom offered his congratulations more quietly but with evident satisfaction. Ranch needs a mistress, he said gruffly, shaking Henry's hand. Always has. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Felicity made the journey to Denver, accompanied by Henry, who insisted on seeing her safely settled before returning to the ranch. The city held mixed emotions for her memories of fear and flight, but also of her earlier life as a teacher, of friends and small joys before Frank had entered her life. The lawyers were surprised to meet her in person, having expected correspondence to settle the matter. They were even more surprised by her plans for the estate. Felicity arranged for the house to be sold, with the proceeds donated to a home for women in difficult circumstances. The business interests she liquidated as well, investing the money with a reputable bank in Cheyenne, closer to her new home. The cash she divided half to be donated to various charities in Denver, half to secure her future with Henry. When she explained her decisions to Henry, he protested the amount she was setting aside. You've earned that money, Felicity. It should go to your future, not to strangers. Our future is secure without it, she replied firmly. The ranch provides what we need. This money can help women who aren't as fortunate as I've been, women who haven't found their Henry Vance to stand between them and danger. He couldn't argue with that. Before they left Denver, Felicity paid one last visit to her former school, meeting with the headmistress to establish a scholarship for girls who couldn't afford the tuition. It would be funded by part of the money she had set aside, a lasting good to come from Frank's wealth. 2 months after the letter arrived, Felicity and Henry were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch. The entire community turned out for the celebration, neighboring ranchers, townspeople from Cody, even Mary from the cafe, who provided a magnificent wedding cake. Felicity wore a new dress of pale blue silk, the fabric purchased in Denver during her stay there, while Henry looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit that Sarah had insisted he buy for the occasion. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of wildflowers in the ranch yard, Felicity felt the last shadows of her past life finally fade away. Frank Donovan had tried to possess her, to control her through fear. In the end, he had inadvertently given her the means to build a life of her own choosing, with a man who respected her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. "I, Henry, take you, Felicity, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Henry said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it was her turn, Felicity spoke the traditional words with equal conviction, but added her own promise at the end. "And I vow to never run from you, but always toward you, for all the days of my life." The first year of their marriage brought changes to the ranch and to their lives. With some of Felicity's inheritance, they were able to purchase additional acreage adjoining their property, expanding the operation and hiring more hands. The house was enlarged, with a proper parlor added, and the kitchen expanded to accommodate the growing number of people who took their meals there. Sarah and Tom remained, their roles evolving from employees to family as the ranch prospered. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Felicity discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought Henry a joy she had never seen in him before, a softening of the last hard edges of the man who had grown up defending himself against his father's fists, who had built his life through stubborn determination and self-reliance. "A family of our own," he marveled, his hand gently cradling her still flat abdomen. "Something I never thought I'd have." "Nor I," Felicity admitted. "Not after Frank. I'd given up on the idea of marriage, children, a normal life." "And now?" Henry asked, his eyes searching hers. "Now I can't imagine any other life but this one," she replied honestly. "With you, with our child, with this land that's become home." Their son, James Thomas Vance, was born on a crisp October morning as the first snow dusted the distant mountains. He had his father's green eyes and his mother's quiet determination, and from his earliest days he was the center of their world. As James grew, the ranch prospered. 2 years after his birth, Felicity gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Michael and Emma. The house rang with children's laughter, and Henry discovered a talent for storytelling that delighted not only his own children, but the children of the ranch hands as well. Felicity found her own role expanding beyond the household. With her education and Henry's encouragement, she became involved in establishing the school Tom had mentioned during her first days at the ranch. By the time James was ready for formal education, the one-room schoolhouse serving the surrounding ranches was completed, with a young teacher from Cheyenne in residence. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Henry surprised Felicity with a special gift, a small cabin built on the shore of the lake that marked the northern boundary of their expanded property. It was a private retreat, a place they could escape to when Sarah insisted on watching the children for a night. "I thought you might like somewhere quiet to read, to write," Henry explained as he showed her the simple but comfortable interior. "Somewhere that's just ours, away from the busy ranch." Felicity explored the cabin with delight, noting the bookshelves already stocked with volumes from their growing library, the desk positioned to catch the morning light, the comfortable bed with its handmade quilt. "It's perfect," she said, turning to embrace him. "Absolutely perfect." Henry held her close, his cheek resting against her hair. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked, puzzled. "For staying. For choosing this life, this ranch, me, when you could have had so much more." Felicity pulled back to look at him, cupping his face between her hands. "Henry Vance, when will you understand? I didn't settle for less. I chose exactly what I wanted. You gave me something Frank Donovan, with all his money, never could: freedom. The freedom to love without fear, to build a life on my own terms." She kissed him softly. "There's nothing more valuable than that." The years continued to be kind to the Vance family. James grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's affinity for ranching and his mother's love of books. The twins developed distinct personalities: Michael, adventurous and outgoing, Emma, quiet and observant with a talent for drawing that Felicity encouraged. When James was 12, Felicity gave birth to their fourth child, another daughter they named Sarah Grace, in honor of the woman who had welcomed Felicity to the ranch and who had become like a mother to her over the years. The older Sarah wept with joy when they told her, declaring it the greatest honor of her life. Through it all, through the challenges of ranching life, through droughts and harsh winters, through children's illnesses and the normal strains of marriage, Henry and Felicity remained steadfast in their devotion to each other. The foundation they had built that day on the porch, when Felicity had chosen to stay despite the fortune awaiting her in Denver, proved strong enough to weather any storm. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, they would sit on that same porch where they had first acknowledged their love, watching the stars emerge over the Wyoming landscape. In those moments, they would remember the day they met a terrified woman, a determined gunman, and the cowboy who had stepped between them with calm courage. "He'll kill us both," she had said. "Then let him try," he had replied. Frank Donovan had tried and failed, not just to kill them but to prevent the life they had built together. In the end, his obsession had led only to his own destruction, while the couple he had inadvertently brought together had found a happiness neither had believed possible. It was, Felicity often thought, the most unexpected and precious outcome imaginable. From danger and fear had come safety and love, from a moment of violence, a lifetime of peace. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led exactly where she was meant to be, home, with the man who had risked everything for a stranger and found his heart's companion in the process. And that, she knew with absolute certainty, was worth everything.